Welcome, beer lovers. I'm excited to share an exclusive insight into one of San Francisco's brewing icons, the Anchor Brewing Company. I had the privilege of interviewing Scott Ungermann, their brewmaster, back in 2020, and he really shared some pretty amazing secrets. He covered the unique process of brewing their signature steam beer, and he also talked about the inventing of the American porter and other brews too. He really covered it all. And to top it all off, Scott shares the story behind Liberty Ale, because it isn't just another beer. This is a tale of brewing revolution sparked by a simple recipe. And stay to the very end, Scott reveals a surprising twist about Liberty Ale that you really just won't believe. It's a fascinating dive into the rich history of Anchor Brewing Company. Don't miss this one. So let's get started.
I'm going to talk about the history of Anchor Brewing. First and foremost, tell our story a little bit from 1896 until today. I'm going to talk about our beers within the context of that story. Specifically, tell the story of Fritz Maytag, because he left such a mark on this brewery and on the brewing world. And the beers that we're going to talk about today, the three that we're going to sample, two of the three of those were his first two real big innovations, and they're still beers that we're making today and beers that are historically significant and delicious. And then we're going to talk a little bit about open fermentation also, and what that does to a beer, and really kind of tie that around the beers we're tasting as well. Anchor Brewing specifically, I should first set the stage here. I am sitting in a room we call the library. You can see the books behind me back there, and a beer or two, and some other interesting artifacts that all were left here by Fritz Maytag. So this was his office, the room in which I'm sitting right now. And so to be sitting in Fritz's office and talking about his legacy is an honor, and a wonderful and fun thing for me to be able to do, to be able to sit here and taste some beers and talk about beer. And so I gather from the poll that most people know the overall history of Anchor, so I can just kind of touch on some high points. And that's, we trace our roots in San Francisco all the way back to really to Gold Rush times, with a tavern here in San Francisco from the 1870s, and then officially changed hands and changed our name to Anchor Brewing in 1896. So that's where we trace our roots to. And as the brewery kind of floundered around post-Prohibition, even though it did reopen as really the only brewery still making steam beer out here on the West Coast, they had lost their way by the 60s, and were about to close their doors for really the third time when Fritz Maytag came upon the scene. And when he decided to buy this brewery, he saved not just a little struggling brewery, but he saved a style of beer from getting wiped away. And we have to thank for that he saved steam beer and created this magical place. The brewery we're in today is, if you haven't ever toured it, it is a destination brewery. If you're coming to San Francisco, you got to come see this brewery and walk around. It's a church to handcrafted beer in America. And it's Fritz bought this current building after he had some success in the 70s. He bought a building that was built in the 30s. So it's this fortress of a building built in the Art Deco style with steel and concrete, and built to be a production facility. It was a coffee roastery for its first 4 years. And then Fritz bought it and retrofitted it, went to Germany, bought this beautiful copper brew house that he had basically the whole building kind of taken apart and put back together again. And by 1979, Fritz started brewing here, and we've been here ever since. And so now we're in our 41st year of brewing in this building, and doing it on equipment that was built in the 50s and 60s and installed in the 70s. And of course, we have some new stuff too. But really, something from every decade over the last 6 decades is involved in our process in one way or another. And we got brewers doing it by hand and making a very interesting style of beer that you can't really find a lot of places. Steam beer is unique to San Francisco, unique to really to Anchor Brewing because Fritz trademarked steam beer. Others can make California Commons, but really only we can make Anchor steam beer. And the way in which we make it is what makes it so special, and what makes it a beer that really is like no other. So that's where we're going to start our tasting with the original Anchor Steam beer that has roots all the way back to Gold Rush times. Of course, Fritz updated the recipe when he bought the brewery and got things turned around in the late 60s. But really, we've been making it the same way ever since. And it's a fairly simple beer, really, in that the ingredients are very simple. It's 90% pale malt and 10% caramel malt. It's fermented with a lager yeast that is our unique strain. It's fermented in an open fermenter. That is a very primitive process, but something that is in its own way. It gives the beer a type of elegance that you can't find in other lager beers. And we use Northern Brewer hops. So like I said, it's a simple recipe. It's tried and true. The open fermenters themselves are a sight to behold, and really, it's not just a sight; it's a sensory experience where you literally use all five senses when you're in that room and you smell the fermentation and you feel like you're within the breathing heart of the brewery, the beating heart of the brewery. So that being said, I've talked myself into thirst. This is the famous Anchor Steam beer. As I said, a California Common to everyone else. Steam beer to us. And it pours a beautiful copper-colored amber lager. I poured vigorously, like I like to do. Get a nice good head of foam. Give it time to settle. Smell it. The way I taste beer, always I look at it first, look at the clarity, look at the color, but then allow it to breathe a little bit and take in a deep breath and smell that beautiful estery aromatic. It's not particularly hoppy. There are hops in there. You get them. It's Northern Brewer hop. It's a spicy hop, a little bit herbal. But the maltiness, because there's a healthy dose of caramel malt in there, you smell the malt, and this is a beer that's about balance. It's a drinkable lager beer that's not too heavy, quite crisp and refreshing, but also complex in its malty aromatics and flavor, and the esters that jump out at you, especially as it warms up in the glass, really do set it apart from other lagers. Cheers. So that's Anchor Steam beer. I've been asked a lot about this beer this week. I mean, I get asked about it a lot, but specifically this week, some people might realize that the San Francisco 49ers are going to be in the Super Bowl. And as San Francisco's beer, I've been asked on several articles already for beer and food pairings for the Super Bowl. And when I talk about steam beer and pairing food with steam beer, to me, it's a really easy one because this beer goes great with almost any food. Because it's so balanced between its maltiness and hoppiness, its sweetness and its bitterness. It really complements a whole host of different foods, but we really like to serve it with San Francisco specialties like fresh crab and other seafood dishes. To me, steamed clams, steamed with Anchor Steam beer, is a signature dish. And if you're going out of your way this Sunday to put together a spread that includes maybe some San Francisco things and some Kansas City things, I would recommend some seafood and some Anchor Steam beer.
Well, that is one delicious beer. I have thoroughly enjoyed it. Are we going to jump into another one? Which one do we want to do next?
Yeah, so let me tell the story of of Fritz just a little bit more, and that's that you talk about where the brewing world was in 1965 when Fritz bought this brewery. He was already kind of a pioneer out there with a beer that was very different than mainstream beers. And in the 50s and 60s, um, the the brewing industry was the exact opposite, the things that were happening in the overall industry were the exact opposite of what's been happening over our last couple decades. The big breweries were getting bigger, and the small breweries were just closing up left and right. And this brewery was about to be another brewery that went out of business, and they were making a beer that looked like this, not a light and pale lager beer like everybody else was making. And Fritz spent 7 years from 1965 to 72 really just making one brand of beer, just making Anchor Steam beer. It was the one and only thing that this brewery, when he bought the brewery, it was draft only. So it wasn't until the early 70s that he even got himself a bottling line. But he only had one brand of beer. And when it came time to introduce a new beer in the early 70s, what Fritz wanted to do was the exact opposite of what the industry was doing. So he wanted to make a dark beer. Everybody was going lighter. Fritz went the other way and decided to go darker. So he went to England, he went to Ireland, and did some research on some porters and some stouts, and really came up with the idea that there wasn't anything that he specifically wanted to copy, but he wanted to make a beer that was styled after the English porter because he was very intrigued by it. But then he set about making an entirely American porter. He made it with American malts and American hops. He made it with open fermentation, which is what he knew. So he really took an existing style and made it America's own, and therefore it really is America's first porter and the prototype for all American porters that come after it. So yes, Anchor Porter. And I got a special glass for mine. I did suggest, Doug, that the pint glass. We're not too fussy with our glassware here. But a pint glass, fine for all beers, really. But when I serve myself a dark beer, and especially with Christmas ale, or I see there's some old Foghorn supporters out there, the porter I like to put in a goblet, and I have this special goblet that was just sent to me just before Christmas by a guy in England who was having trouble finding porter, and I sent him, and I know, Doug, it can be the further you get away from the brewery, the harder it is to find other brands. But I gave him some tips. I sent him a list of possibilities, and I also sent him a swag pack of some various things. And the guy actually sent me with a handwritten note back, sent me this beautiful cut crystal goblet from his hometown in England. I've only used it one other time. I put Christmas ale in it right after I got it in the mail. So this is my second christening of this particular glass with Anchor Porter. So I like to pour in a goblet or a big old wine glass. I mean, I like my dark beers to have room to breathe and really get in there. So I said Anchor Steam is a relatively simple recipe. When we get to Liberty Ale, it's also a relatively simple recipe. Porter is not. There's a complex array of malts in here. Simple hop bill, but with a porter, you don't need to. If you're not featuring the hops, there's no reason to go crazy. But this one's all about the malt, roasted and toasted, and some chocolate malt and some black malt and various other things. I don't have the recipe committed to memory. Like I said, it's a complex one, but it's a really nice, rounded, and not overbearing porter.
Yeah, I think it's one of the nicest porters, in my opinion. I tend to prefer, I guess, the less citrusy hops in porters. And this, I guess this has maybe Northern Brewer. I mean,
it also has Northern Brewer in it. It's the same hop as Anchor Steam. And I believe we use a bearing hop in there too, or the hops in porter have kind of gone back and forth over the years. It's like I said, it's not a beer that's about the hops. So as long as we hit the right amount of bitterness, we're not trying to showcase any hop aroma, particularly in this beer. It's much more about the malt. It's about that roasted character, but it's also a drinkability that's not too sweet, um, and really has a lot of texture to it.
That's delicious. I mean, I love it. It has some nice chocolate on the nose. It's not overly roasty. It's just I wouldn't want to call it chocolate milk, but it certainly has no sweetness, but it is such a nice, pleasant mocha experience. Very nice.
Yeah, a great dessert beer, but also, I'll drink this beer on a sunny afternoon. I have no qualms about sitting down and putting back a porter time of day or night.
I actually like these when they've aged a little bit because I've found they'll get
Yeah,
a little
we've
raisin.
found that porter ages very, very nicely, and we give it a little longer shelf life than the other beers because it does age so nicely.
So what are some unique aspects of your porter? I like it because, again, I'm not big on the citrusy American hops that are put in a lot of porters. Can you
Yeah,
elaborate?
I think once again the unique fermentation process that we use for most of our beers. This particular beer is fermented in our open ale fermenters, so they're deep, like square, almost the shape of a Yorkshire square type of fermenter, but stainless steel with a glycol jacket, so we can cool. So that makes it different than the open fermenters that we ferment. Anchor Steam and California Lager are what you call shallow pan open fermenters. So, less than 3 feet deep, really, really low pressure on the yeast during fermentation, and a free rise fermentation because there's no temperature control other than the temperature of the room. So that's how we make steam. In comparison, the porter is in an open fermentation, but it's a deeper vessel. So there is a little bit of pressure, but there's no back pressure because it's open. But there's some liquid pressure on it because it's a deeper fermenter. And then we can control the temperature. It's not a full free rise, but it's still a fairly quick open fermentation. And then we drop it down into the cellar tanks where we actually krausen our porter. So that makes it unique as well.
Well, I think it is one nice beer. And
Yeah,
I have
it
to
is.
say, I prefer it over the steam just personally because I just think it's one of the best. And I could finish that off in a hurry.
Yeah, well, it is. It's the as far as when you talk about styles of beer. I mean, this beer invented the style American Porter. So after that, everything compares to it very nicely. But it's really when you come first, you have to kind of set the standard, and I think this one really does a nice job of that.
Well, excellent one. So we're going to move into the Liberty next?
Yeah, absolutely. So Liberty Ale, to continue on the story of Fritz in the 70s here in San Francisco. So porter in the early 70s, and then that was the first innovation really from Fritz. And then in the mid 70s, 75 to be exact, Fritz wanted to commemorate the bicentennial for those of us who were around in the mid 70s. And I was just a little kid, but I still remember that the bicentennial coming in 76 was a big deal. And Fritz was a year ahead of that and wanted to mark the 200th anniversary of Paul Revere's ride. You got to remember that Fritz was a history major, so he cared about things like that. And in fact, he wanted to make a beer on April 18th, 1975, to commemorate Paul Revere and his ride, and he wanted to name it Liberty Ale. And this is what we get. And what Fritz did here that was another massive innovation at the time, and porter wasn't really a massive innovation. This was much more groundbreaking. Is that Fritz had a new hop that he was interested in, that he had heard about from his friends up in the Pacific Northwest, the Cascade hop, which wasn't really in wide use at the time. And Fritz wanted to also do something that he had only read about, and that was a process called dry hopping, which is really, at that time in the mid 70s, was a lost and essentially a dead art, the art of dry hopping. And so Fritz had to reinvent the concept of dry hopping, and he did it for Liberty Ale, and he did it by getting large mesh bags and filling them up full of whole cone Liberty or Cascade hops, and putting them in the bottom of that secondary fermentation. You remember I said we ferment primary open fermentation, and then we'll drop into a secondary tank. And in that aging tank, Fritz had Cascade hops waiting for Liberty Ale when it came down, and dry hopping was born. And so another beer, when you talk about historical precedents, this beer, all dry hopped American pale ales, IPAs, etc., everything lends its history to this beer right here in San Francisco, Liberty Ale. And we got you some fresh Liberty Ale, Doug. I was happy to be able to send that out. Liberty Ale is a tough one to find. It doesn't have as wide a distribution as it used to. But you can see on that beautiful fresh Liberty Ale there that it pours a beautiful golden hue. It is, by today's standards, what I would call a delicately hopped pale ale at about a half a pound per barrel, dry hops. By 1975 standards, this was the hoppiest beer on the planet. People didn't know what to do with it. I was introduced to this beer when I was in college in the 80s and grew fond of it from that point on. And it's a special beer for me and my friends, and many people in the brewing industry. There's so much love for this beer and so much reverence for it because of where it stands in the pantheon of beers. So Liberty Ale, you can smell those fresh Cascade hops, particularly zesty when it's super fresh like this. Does mellow out when it gets a little age on it. It'll also pick up a little haze when it gets a little age on it.
This one is sparkling clear. I mean,
yeah.
It's absolutely brilliant.
And that was bottled last week, Doug. So you're not going to find beer that fresh out in the marketplace. But it, even when it does throw a little haze and when it's got a little age on it, it's still the character there, and especially the way we brew this beer, that it's got a fair amount of late kettle hopping, and you can really taste the hops. It's not just dry hopped for aromatics. There's a hop flavor in there that is that it's pure Cascade, because this is, when I talk about simple recipes, this is 100% Pale 2 row malt, 100% Cascade hops.
So that is, I'm about to drink that whole thing if I'm not careful. The difference between this and the pale ale and the IPA, how would you relate those?
Well, it's something we've been discussing internally here. We got a new marketing team that's come on board within the last year, and they're talking about, how do we reinvigorate Liberty Ale? It's such a beautiful beer, but people kind of don't know what to do with it because it doesn't say on the label what it is. It just says Liberty Ale. It doesn't classify itself as a pale ale. It doesn't. It did in the past. There was a time when we said America's first IPA on the six-pack carrier itself, and we've removed that and all references to it, because what it does is confuses the customer. You get this beer and somebody tells you it's an IPA, you taste it and you're like, this is not an IPA. Not by today's standards. Yes, it's a forefather of all IPAs. Historically, it matters in all those senses, and it's a great and drinkable beer, but it's not an IPA. It's not a session IPA. It's more of a pale ale. And it's not necessarily even an American style pale ale, even though it's in that neighborhood, right? And to me, the only logical explanation is it's a pale ale. Okay, it's a golden pale ale, single hop, but it's Liberty Ale. Stands on its own.
It's a phenomenal lawnmower beer. It is
Yeah,
so refreshing and so light, and just enough bitterness that it finishes nice and dry. I mean, I guess you might call it a gateway craft beer for someone who hasn't quite gotten into the pale ales or the IPAs. This is a gateway beer for
I can buy that.
them. Well, that is one delicious beer. I have thoroughly enjoyed that, and I guess I've moved down the line for the most with that one. That is just really refreshing. So, if someone was trying to explain to someone a Liberty versus a pale ale, how would you contrast it?
Well, to me, Liberty is a pale ale, and pale ales. There's such a wide range of today's pale ale, whether it's a British pale ale, an American pale ale, whether it's a Northwest style, whether it's um, a modern American pale ale. It's to me, it's an ale. It's pale. It's bitter, but not overly bitter. It's hoppy, but not overly hoppy. So to me, it sits in that category of pale ale.
What are the IBUs? Do you know offhand?
Yeah, it's right around 40, maybe 42.
Really? Okay, I would have guessed it might be a little lower than that, but it's quite pleasant. You and Anchor have a huge fan base, and we appreciate your time so much, Scott. I know you need to run, and thank you for your generosity with your time.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks again for having me on. It's a pleasure talking about beer. And
Wow, that's a real journey we've been on, diving deep into the heart of Anchor Brewing Company, guided by none other than their brewmaster, Scott Ungermann. I just love the stories behind the beers we love. Bring us even closer with every sip. Now, if you enjoyed this insider look as much as I did, give this video a thumbs up and show your support. Every like means the world to us, and it helps others find these stories. Now, remember, the journey doesn't stop here. Check out these specialty videos handpicked for you for more behind-the-scenes stories and conversations that will try and quench your thirst for knowledge. So until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep enjoying great beer. Cheers!